Astonishing Legends is bringing you a commercial-free bonus show as a token of gratitude for our listeners, without whom the show wouldn't be possible. It's your ongoing support of our sponsors and patrons on patreon.com that keep Astonishing Legends free to listen to. Thank you so much, and we hope you enjoy the show tonight.
Last week, we acted like we were going to talk about all of the DB Cooper hijacking suspects. Unfortunately, we had so much more to cover regarding the chain of events following it that we ran out of time. So tonight, we take a look at a dozen or so of our favorite suspects and more than a few theories about who DB Cooper may have been. Although the FBI doesn't take it seriously, conspiracy theorists have even floated the idea that he didn't exist at all. The perfect crime? Maybe. Tonight, we'll take a look at the FBI's profiling of potential suspects and the evidence that has been put forth as possibly connected to the crime. After that, we'll finally take a look at some of the most prominent suspects and leave you with our theories and conclusions. Wherever we end up, as of today, DB Cooper got away with this crime. And if something definitive isn't figured out soon, it may go unsolved forever. Welcome back to Astonishing Legends. I'm Forrest Burgess, and this is Scott Philbrook.
I'm pretty sure we're going to have to go to 3 parts. I don't think there's any way that, that this can just be part 2. It would be like 5 hours long.
Scott Philbrook, like at Fortiana East, as we sat down to record part 2 of our series on DB Cooper.
Join us tonight for part 3, our final part of our series on DB Cooper.
And we're back, and we didn't even mean to be.
Yeah, we're stumbling back into your lives and commercial free tonight. Not only that, our editor Sarah was busy this week, so I actually had to edit this show myself. Now, having not actually done that as of recording these words that I wrote for us to say, this housekeeping stuff, I'm going to go ahead and apologize for the edit. I do not possess her mojo, and on top of that, it takes me 3 times as long. But believe it or not, I did cut all of our shows for the first, I think it was the first 36 episodes, so.
Aha! That's why none of them make sense. And you're cutting corners so you can save yourself some free time later.
Exactly. Let's keep this moving. Let's keep this moving.
Jeez. All right. I don't blame you, actually. You know what? Really, remember our idea back in our post-production days for what was a machine called the Edit Box?
Yes.
And you just throw your tapes into this magic machine, or I guess it'd be now digital files, and it just spits out a show.
Yes. And every now and then I read an article about something that supposedly does that, but when you watch what it made, it stinks. So sooner or later, they'll get there.
Bot editing. Well, okay. I don't know how we were even, though, doing what you just described. I was working all the time, full time, late hours, and you were editing the show by yourself.
Yeah, in addition to us recording it. I'm not sure how we did that either. Sometimes I wake up in the morning, I'm like, how did I get here?
Letting the days go by, let the water hold me down.
That's not even my favorite Talking Head song. It's probably my second favorite Talking Head song.
Yeah, what's your first?
This Must Be the Place. That's one of my favorite. That's a top 10 song for me, actually. Not just Talking Heads. Yeah, I love This Must Be the Place.
Me
or
too.
Home.
And
I think in parentheses it's Home. But when you look it up on Spotify.
That's true, yes.
Yeah.
Yes. You're right. And speaking of editing, that thing fits with anything you're editing.
Yes, it
a
does.
Cooking show, a car, a car reveal. It works for everything.
Yes.
Which is another jam of it.
It's too bad an ASCAP license to actually play it legally is like $30,000 just for the license. And then to license that track would probably be $500,000. So it's going to be a while before we can put that in the show. You just have to listen to us. Right. Anyway, we got a lot of fun DB Cooper stuff to talk about tonight, but a few very quick thoughts first. One thing is a lot of changes are coming very soon. Big changes.
Wait a second. You're going to drop this date now?
Yeah, I'm dropping the date, October 1st. I mean, why not? The rest of the secrets are going to stay secret until our special announcement about it all, which is probably going to drop into our feed around the 28th. So don't overlook that just because it's short and doesn't look like a show. There's a lot of big news in that. So when that comes out, be sure and check it out. And it's, it's all directly related to Astonishing Legends. It's not an RSS drop or something advertising another show. This is pertinent stuff. So please check it out.
Well, alrighty, Mr. Spoiler Alert. In the meantime, though, thanks again for purchasing the Kecksburg Volunteer Fire Department shirts. Only a few more days to do that, as we're taking it out of the store the night of September 30th.
All right, that's all we got tonight, mostly, so I'll have less to edit. But trust me, folks, do not miss the announcement that's coming up. A lot of exciting stuff there. And like I said, they'll probably be out on the 28th.
Okay, well, let's pick up where we left off. And not to torture you, but first, a shameless plug for myself. Well, really, come on, it's for the show. And to let you all know about a great way to find terrific new podcasts to listen to. It's called Find That Pod. So Sebastian Archiszewski, whose title is Chief Podcast Discovery Dude at Find That Pod, reached out to us for an interview. And since Scott was busy doing his Scott stuff, I took up the challenge. So it's just me answering the questions. And if for some unimaginable reason you haven't gotten enough of me assaulting your ears by blathering on and on and on and on and on in our usual audio format, you can now read about me blathering on and on and on, and assault your eyes and brain as well. And no, it's not a podcast about finding great podcasts. It's an online blog and a weekly newsletter you can subscribe to about finding great podcasts and getting to know the podcasters. Anyway, I spent quite a while really thinking about my answers, and it pretty much tells the story of our show, my thoughts about AL and podcasting in general, etc., etc. And no, they didn't have to set up a whole other website just to post all my jibber jabber. So go check it out at findthatpod.com/interview-forest-burgess, or just go to findthatpod.com and poke around.
And where was that?
At findthatpod.com.
No. I mean, where did we leave off last time?
Oh, well, where we left off last time and are just about to begin now is, what does the FBI think about all this? Because, of course, all of us who do love true crime and fake crime as well want to get to the profiling, because that's such the hot topic nowadays. Well, what was the FBI's profiling of Cooper? So Scott and I will just talk about some discussion points here as they were laid out in the case at the time. The first one, Cooper may have been with the Air Force, as we mentioned previously, because he knew the driving time was about 20 minutes from SeaTac Airport to McChord Air Force Base, and he was familiar with the Seattle area and could recognize Tacoma from the air.
Yes.
Now,
but he could also have been a pilot. A pilot might have been able to make that recognition as well, but that's But it makes sense, especially to know about the how far it was on the ground, and then also to recognize it from the air.
Now, that doesn't necessarily mean, he was a seasoned Air Force pilot or a smoke jumper, all these other conclusions. You have to keep in mind that anybody who took a lot of flights from Portland to Seattle for business or whatever would know that, looking out the window. Anybody who drove around the area, my friend Arnie in Seattle knows the driving time between McChord and SeaTac Airport. So a civilian could know that as well, but it does start to point to a picture, a background, a profile of who this guy is. And that's all you got with this guy. He's so mysterious. You have to put these clues together. Well, there's really two main investigators from the FBI on the case. And the first one was retired FBI Chief Investigator Ralph Himmelsbach, author of Norjack, The Investigation of DB Cooper. At the time when this happened, he was the lead FBI investigator assigned to the case. And I believe he wrote that book after his retirement and has now sadly passed away. But like any good investigator will tell you, he stated that criminals like extortionists who steal large amounts of money, they need the money urgently because of a desperate situation. Otherwise, it's really not worth the risk to them. Or Cooper could have just been a thrill seeker, seeing if he could get away with it, or just that the feat could be done. And regarding his book, Norjack, The Investigation of DB Cooper, here's a little intro from Amazon that sums up the book and his beliefs. That Cooper probably had a criminal record, that he'd probably received military training, and that he was obviously familiar with the Pacific Northwest. And then the book also gives reasons why he believes Cooper died in the fall. And now here's something from the Wayback Machine, that Internet Archive that we've been referring to. It's an article I think we mentioned in part 2 called Enigma, DB Cooper. And the wording from this article sounds like they pulled it from official FBI statements or the official FBI website at the time. Some of those articles on the FBI.gov website have been taken down or compiled into something else. They've done some rearranging because this has gone on quite a long time. I think there's over 60 volumes of investigative material that's been compiled over the years. So it's a lot of material. So they just summarize at this point.
Thank God it's the FBI, because if it wasn't an investigation this old, a lot of stuff would just be gone because partners burn them up in sheds behind houses.
You're still sore about that.
Houses get moved. People leave them behind in attics.
The FBI did what they can for so many decades. And it's like, look, we've come to the end of our trail here, but have at it. If any of you can figure this out, by all means.
And there's a point at which they want to stop spending money on it as well. So,
well, right. Because there are other things that they need to attend to. Well, these next statements pretty much sums up retired Agent Himmelsbach's thoughts on the case, that he was most likely injured on impact. And again, he worked on the case from 1971 to 1980, and he basically posits that Cooper died by the side of a creek, and then, quote, and then later the creek overflowed and carried him and the money downstream where the money was found. And Himmelsbach believes if Cooper's body is going to be discovered at all, it would be near the Washougal River. And he has that one quote here: I have to confess, if I were going to look for Cooper, I would head for the Washougal. Well, there's another agent as well who took over after he did. I'm not sure directly in succession, but he's the other famous FBI agent on the case, and that's Special Agent Larry Carr.
Yes, and I don't think he's on the case anymore, but he does feature prominently in Brad Meltzer's Decoded series on DB Cooper. So you get a chance to hear and see him talk there. And he's one of the guys that's like said, we're going to take information from the public here and let people participate in this, especially people who have professional experience. And that's when he gets involved with the paleontologist who we mentioned before, and other scientists who could help deduce what they could from the evidence they had. So he led the investigation team for the FBI in the Seattle field office from 2006 until 2016. And this is actually from the Enigma article Forrest was just referencing. Quote, Cooper was no expert skydiver. We originally thought Cooper was an experienced jumper, perhaps even a paratrooper. We concluded after a few years this was simply not true. No experienced parachutist would have jumped in the pitch black night, in the rain, with a 200-mile-an-hour wind in his face. Carr goes on to say it was simply too risky. He also missed that his reserve chute was only for training and had actually been sewn shut. This is something that a skilled skydiver would have checked, end quote. Mm-hmm. So there you go. That's Carr's position on it. The hijacker also, according to him, had no help on the ground either. To have utilized an accomplice, Cooper would have needed to coordinate closely with the flight crew so he could jump at just the right moment and hit the right drop zone. But Cooper simply said, fly to Mexico. And he had no idea where he was really when he jumped, most likely. There was also no visibility on the ground due to cloud cover at 5,000 feet, and the plane was at 10,000 feet. So it was a mile over that.
And that's the important part, is that visually he doesn't know. It's night, it's dark, there's cloud cover. There's no GPS back then. So he doesn't, he's jumping into the unknown, literally just a blanket of clouds. And how could he know? And how could he arrange a rendezvous with someone on the ground, or even a general landing zone area? He couldn't. He's just jumping into nothing. So that points to, as I say, a lot of his rationale about this. What is he doing? Is there any method beyond just getting this thing together to begin with? So in summation, the FBI thinks that for him to survive, he would have needed help on the ground, or, like somebody picking him up after he landed, taking him to a safe house location. Or he may have also needed help from the flight crew, and there's no evidence of that at all. And even if he survived those conditions, again, he can't do this on his own with what he has on him. So therefore, he needs an accomplice. And that's even if he survived the jump at all. As we talked about last time, this is very perilous. This is also why both of these agents here believe that, he probably didn't survive at all. He's jumping into a national forest here with a lot of tall trees that, just think about it, you're wearing a chute, you're most likely going to get hung up.
Yeah, I agree with that. And there's a couple of things about that. I mean, one thing, too, was he couldn't necessarily be sure of his altitude, which was interesting because he had told the pilot to fly at 10,000 feet with the flaps at 15 degrees. But there was no way for him to know that. Now, there's some reports that he had warned the crew that he was wearing an altimeter, but according to Sluggo's website that we mentioned in part 2, that seems to be a really good source of information, that's a myth. He warned that he was wearing an altimeter that somehow got into the story, as details do along the way with stories this old.
Yeah. Well, the other thing that we mentioned, I think in part 2 is that, yes, so he would have, to avoid having get hung up in tall evergreens, he would have had to steer to a patch or a clear patch or a meadow, a farmland. And this chute was not steerable, the one he chose. And although the initial FBI military, air, and ground search did find some broken treetops and what looked like parachute remnants, upon closer inspection, none of these provided any directly related clues. So Carr goes on to say, diving into the wilderness without a plan, without the right equipment, in such terrible conditions, he probably never even got his chute open.
Yeah, and I just want to quickly say a couple of things about that. One is Himmelsbach is convinced that he was maybe a career criminal. It's a very specific kind of profile idea that he has. And then Carr is convinced that he didn't survive the jump. But I would just want to remind everyone, all of that is speculative. They have no proof either way that he did or didn't survive it. They have no idea. And I can't help but wonder, like when Carr says, he probably never even got his chute open. If this is meant to needle the guy that's out there and get him to come back and be like, you bet I got it open. What are you doing saying I didn't get it open? Because I feel like it's a little bit too much of an instigation to be like, this guy never made it, because you're trying to get the guy to be like, I made it. So I think that's, you got to think about the psychology of all that, because
no, you're absolutely right. That's another tactic that law enforcement does, is sometimes they can provoke a response, because think about it. This guy has got a pair on him. It's to try and accomplish what he did with as little as he did. Either he just doesn't care, or he does have a great plan, or he thinks he does. There could be some amount of ego that goes with this that might get him to respond. And as we'll see, there were some responses later. But in addition to all that, Carr states that Cooper either didn't bring with him or didn't request a helmet. That's another thing. In such a dangerous jump, very easily he could have knocked his head against something. And he didn't take the newer and technically better parachute with him. And he jumped into what likely would have been a 15-degree temperature with a wind chill effect at about 10,000 feet. So even with maybe wearing long underwear, or long johns as we used to call them, with a rainstorm he was jumping into, and knowing Western Washington is wet, cold, and rainy that time of year in late November, he would have likely been soaked from head to toe soon after jumping, and possibly could have succumbed to hypothermia if he didn't have help.
Well, there was this eyewitness, and you don't hear a whole lot about him when you look at the broad strokes of this case. A lot of people don't know about this guy. His name was William Mitchell, or Bill Mitchell. He was a sophomore in college, and he sat in the row right across from Dan Cooper, whoever he was.
Ooh, yeah.
And he got a good look at him. And I'm pretty sure, you don't hold me to this, but I'm pretty sure that the second drawing you see of Cooper in the illustrations, the sketches that the FBI has, I'm pretty sure that came from Mitchell's description of him. And what I remember reading about it, now honestly, I want to cite where I saw this, but now I honestly can't remember where I saw it. It might have been on Sluggo's defunct website.
I think so. Yeah.
Was that, they didn't know the hijacking was happening. They knew the plane was circling and that sort of thing, but they were doing a very good job of not making it seem like a big thing was going on. But Mitchell, at one point, I guess he got up to go to the bathroom. And when he went by Cooper to go to the bathroom, he noticed that Cooper was staring at him really hard.
Yeah.
And it was so odd how he was staring at him that he actually remembered that, even though he didn't know that that was a hijacking taking place.
Right.
And he brought it up when he was debriefed after all the passengers were taken off the plane. So it's pretty fascinating that he noticed that. And that was his description, it's my understanding, that makes up one of those sketches. And
that's interesting. Yeah.
Yeah, I like that because it's different from one of the flight attendants or someone else. It's a corroborated image in terms of what he looked like. Although there's some dispute over how accurate those images are. The FBI says, well, we don't know if he really looked like that. So there's some questions there, but those two images look pretty similar to be developed independently by two different people. But the other thing that Mitchell saw, which is pretty fascinating, was he could tell, I don't know how, but he noticed that the gentleman was wearing long underwear.
Yeah, I'm sure when his pant leg rode up, if you cross your legs, and back then you could cross your legs sitting in an airplane seat.
Yes,
not so much
bigger.
nowadays.
Yeah.
Yeah, more space. Yeah, you could actually stand up from the window seat and edge your way out to the aisle. Not so much anymore. 12 people have to get up before you can do that. But back then, I could see how if he crossed his legs or he looked down, you could see the long underwear. Maybe it was over his socks. Maybe his socks were pulled over, but he could notice that. The other thing is that it does point to, well, a couple of things here. One, I totally agree. That really cements for me the idea that these sketch drawings, these composite sketches are pretty accurate, which will, in the long run here, put a lot of doubt on some of these suspected suspects, these proposed suspects, because they just don't fit that. And they had such a clear view of this guy that the FBI at least seems to think that these things hold up. And if they're not fitting, the suspects don't fit that profile, that what they look like basically from the sketch, that you have to rule them out. Well, the other thing as well, though, is that you also can't judge too much about his pre-planning on that. As I said, back in the day, a lot of people, especially, Washington State, Idaho, the colder states up north, it's not uncommon to wear that old-fashioned waffled long underwear under some clothes if you knew you were going to be outside for a bit. If you worked outdoors, you had to walk a long ways. It was pretty common to wear that under your clothing.
I feel like it's a weird combo with a suit, though. I feel like that's a blue-collar operation. You've got your long underwear and then some overalls or some Carhartt, which they didn't have back then, something on. Like, I do feel like it's a little odd for a suit. Like you're combining, you're kind of saying, hey, I'm an executive. I've got an important job. Also, I might be very cold and outside tonight.
Well, no, listen to this, though. Back then, a lot of people dressed up a lot more than they do now. And if he was a middle manager type, somebody who had to wear a suit at one of these jobs where perhaps it was a plant, he was an engineer, he worked in scrap or metal fabrication, as evidenced by the microscopic particles that ended up on his tie, then he might be outside a lot, but also having to wear a suit. And in that case, that's all I'm saying is that back then, people I know that would dress up for some of these jobs that people don't dress up for now would have to wear some kind of a suit, but also be outside a lot. And then you can't really, you're still wearing an overcoat. You have to be dressed up. So you want a little more thermal protection. So I'm just saying it's not necessarily points to him knowing that he's going to jump from a plane, or you could look at anything like that. The other thing is that him eyeballing the college student, you might chalk that up to situational awareness.
Yeah, this is a potential threat to me if I don't do this right. Yeah.
Perhaps like a CIA agent would.
Yeah.
Sizing up, but he's Jason Bourne. He's sizing all that up around him. Like, that guy over there, he's 230 pounds and can handle himself.
Right.
All that kind of stuff. Is that part of it? Or is he just like really nervous and waiting for his bourbon and his other 4 Raleigh cigarette smokes as he's sitting on the plane? We don't know, but it's an interesting insight, whereas most people on the plane, as you said, they didn't know what was going on, so they didn't pay attention to Cooper. But this guy was close, and he could see him.
Yeah, and I'm pretty sure, I know we speculated in part 1 about what row he was in, 15, 18. I'm pretty sure in the notes that I've seen, some of the released files, that it was 18. Not that it really matters. I'm sure people are like, oh, it changes everything. But I think he was in row 18, because I think Mitchell definitely was in 18, and he said he was across from him. Yeah.
Right. Yeah, there's some speculation on what seat. You think you could nail that down. But getting back to the Enigma article here, it goes on to state, based on what he has learned so far, here is Carr's profile of Cooper. 1, he served in the Air Force and at some point was stationed in Europe, where he may have become interested in a special comic book. 2, he worked as a cargo loader on planes, giving him knowledge and experience in the aviation industry, which was in its infancy in 1971. Also, because his job required him to throw cargo out of planes, Cooper would have worn an emergency parachute in case he fell out. This would have provided him with working knowledge of parachutes, but not necessarily the functional knowledge to survive the jump he made.
That's interesting. That's an interesting fact. Yeah. I like that assessment. Not that
Agent,
Agent Carr gives 2 craps what I think, but like, but I do like. I don't think I came across that. Yeah, I don't think I. Yeah, but that makes sense. Like just enough to, I mean, there's lots of reasons that might have been his knowledge about parachutes, which we'll talk about. But that's a good one.
Well, I look to investigators, professional investigators, private and public, and law enforcement, because they do this for a living. They've seen a lot of this, and they also follow up on the results. So after a while, you start to develop pretty good profiling techniques. Not that it's infallible, certainly. And a lot of it is due to bias and what the individual thinks, whoever that investigator might be. But so far, it's pretty solid. And he knew a little bit about parachutes. Like, if you threw one to the average person, would they even hook it up right?
Yeah.
Would they get the straps right? Would they know where the ripcord is to pull? Would they have it on upside down?
But isn't Patrick Swayze standing right there? He tells you everything to do.
That's right. Or Treat Williams. He was the pursuit of DB Cooper.
I was making reference to Point Break, which is one of the best filmed skydiving sequences in the history of action filmmaking, I think.
Oh, there's a bunch of them because again, that's another part of this legend that is so appealing to people because it's an exciting thing to do. Look at James Bond. Remember, he dives out of there's a ton of parachute sequences, but one of my favorites is he rides the motorcycle off the edge of the snow cliff there and catches the plane.
Yes.
That's not really skydiving, but he catches up to the plane and steers it just in time. That's what people love about the story here. But to go on with the profiling by Agent Carr here, he may have come from the East Coast, but taken an aviation job in Seattle when he got out of the military. It's possible he lost his job during an economic downturn in the aviation industry in 1970-71. If he was a loner with little or no family, nobody would have missed him after he was gone. So you have to consider all these things. It's like, there's a missing person here.
Yeah.
Or he was missing for a good long weekend. What's the story there? If he did survive.
I got some things to talk about there.
I'll bet you do here. Well, so anyway, but to your point about Agent Carr not caring what you think, his closing statement is, look, so if the public can help by whatever means, maybe we can shake something loose. So have at it, Scott.
Yeah, well, I mean, there's a couple of things about that. One is that, the sense that I got from Special Agent Carr in Brad Meltzer's show, Decoded, about DB Cooper, was that he very much was trying to beat the bushes and let's get some people involved. But I also got, as being an older guy and having wise ways about the world, I'm talking about myself here. It's easy to recognize when someone's boss has said, you don't get any more money for this. You want to keep looking at it? Great. Because it seems to me like Special Agent Carr is like, come ahead. We're inviting the public. It's exciting. Because the thing is, they still want to solve it, but there's only so much budget they have. They got a lot bigger problems to worry about at this point, bigger fish to fry. So let's come back to that. You mentioned that he had an interest in a comic book. That's a big central part of this story that I don't think we've mentioned yet. What is the story with the comic book?
Well, do we talk about where he may have gotten that alias? Because it's pretty well known to people who follow the case, but a lot of people in the general public may not know. Well, Special Agent Larry Carr believes Cooper may have taken that alias from the name of a character in a Franco-Belgian comic book series called Dan Cooper. It was popular around the time of the skyjacking. And what the background is on it, it's a fictional comic book with the main character, a Royal Canadian Air Force test pilot named Dan Cooper. And he has adventures in outer space and with real events of the time period. And in an edition that was published around the date of the crime, November 24th, 1971, comic book Cooper is seen parachuting in a paratrooper uniform on the front cover illustration.
Yeah, that's pretty good. And I just want to remind everyone, in case you don't remember it from the earlier parts of the series, Dan Cooper was the name he gave when he bought the ticket, not DB. That was a mistake by a journalist. So he gave his name as Dan Cooper. So it's a perfect match with this comic book. That's a pretty strong coincidence.
Well, yeah, but listen to this now. The origin of it was conceived in 1954. This is from the wiki entry on the magazine and the series here. It's Tintin Magazine's answer to the Buck Danny series. It was published in the rival Spirou magazine. And speaking of Tintin Magazine, wasn't there a character we mentioned in some previous episode where there was a character name taken from Tintin? That maybe it was Gremlins. I can't remember now, but
yeah, I can't remember now. It does seem familiar, though. I know that we came across it in research prior to this episode.
Yeah, there will be some listeners out there that will remind us. I hope. So
there's a bunch of listeners that think we already did DB Cooper, so maybe they know.
Isn't that strange? Yeah, there's if Tintin comes up one more time, I'm going to officially freak out. Well, But listen to this, Scott. This series was never published in English, nor was it imported into the US. So it does fit with Agent Carr's theory that the real Cooper had spent some time overseas in Europe while in the Air Force. And Carr, interestingly enough, had come across the comic book connection in the DB Cooper web forums, which is also where he found the citizen sleuths who would volunteer to rejuvenate the investigation. That's according to that, the Enigma article here. Well, the Cooper research team, remember we talked about them part 2, made up of scientists, which sounds like an awesome, fun thing to be a part of. They found out that the comic book was also sold in Canada. And they also took note of Cooper's wording with the request of, remember this, negotiable American currency. That's not something most Americans would say. The witnesses who came into contact with Cooper also said he had no recognizable accent. So if he wasn't an American citizen, being a Canadian citizen would be the next best guess, I think.
Or living far enough north to be going back and forth across the border and, you know, having a taste of life in both cultures.
Well, that's the thing. If you live near the Canadian border there in northern Washington state, a lot of people go back and forth. So you would be familiar, though, more so, though, with Western Canada, which is British Columbia. It's more English. So if you go, when I was a kid, if you went into the McDonald's there, it said biscuits. And it's like, well, no, I want a cookie. It's like, no, that's what they call cookies there because they're British. Eastern Canada
Biscuit
being
Royale.
more French. Yeah, so this is more the Belgian Franco sense of Dan Cooper and why it may have a more European connection here.
Yes, I'd like a McBiscuit, please.
Ooh, that does. I could go for one right now.
Well, around here in North Carolina, you get your biscuits at either Bojangles or Mrs. Winter's or Biscuitville, which is not a cookie restaurant. All right, so here we go.
No, wait a second. What about Roy Rogers? You have those there?
No, we don't have those here.
Oh.
No Roy Rogers.
Never been to one, but I do love the Timmy Hortons when I go into Canada land.
Yes, I feel like our friend Jordan Bonaparte, who's in Halifax, Nova Scotia, just posted something about a spooky Hortons or something.
Yeah. Oh, he's got a couple of episodes. Yeah. Weird stuff that happens at Tim Hortons. That's kind of like where weird stuff happens here at McDonald's.
Yes. They don't call it Timmy, do they? You made that up, right? When I'm editing this, do I leave in that you said Timmy?
Yeah,
or
leave it in.
Do
That's
I
the
make
slang.
it Tim?
No,
Okay,
I think Canadians,
all right.
it's Tim Hortons, but they call it Timmy Hortons, I think.
Well, something else that Tom Kay and the Cooper research team considered was Cooper's choice of Thanksgiving Eve for the day of the caper, and his choice to wear a suit when he knew he'd be jumping into the wilderness.
Mm-hmm.
According to Tom Kay, quote, "The FBI searched but couldn't find anyone who disappeared that weekend. If you were planning on going back to work on Monday, then you would need as much time as possible to get out of the woods, find transportation, and get home. The very best time for this is in front of a 4-day weekend, which is the timing Dan Cooper chose for his crime. If he was planning ahead, he knew he had to hitchhike out of the woods, and it is much easier to get picked up in a suit and tie than in old blue jeans." That's
okay,
a quote
true.
from Tom Kay.
Yeah, but think about this. That would also then mean you had to risk exposure to someone while hitchhiking who could report you. Maybe you could try to buy them off, but I think that's even riskier. If it's somebody you don't know, it's another person citing you and giving a description, and you look pretty suspicious. What are you doing out here wearing a thoroughly soaked suit with long underwear and carrying a weird parachute satchel?
That's true, but there are numerous people that reported somebody coming out of the woods that night.
That is also true. That is also strange and weird. It just makes me think of Walter White having to bribe the older Native American gentleman for his truck in Breaking Bad. Remember that?
Yes.
He's got a barrel of cash. Like, can I pay $6 million for your old truck? Back to something else we've talked about and is another significant factor because it's one of the few remaining clues he left on board here. The parachutes. And also his knowledge about aviation. Cooper's actions would suggest that he was somewhat knowledgeable about aircraft, flying, and also the terrain he'd be flying over. And as we discussed in part 1, he requested 4 parachutes, and that may have been a tactic by Cooper to help make sure the FBI wasn't going to sabotage or mark or electronically tag the parachute he was going to take, although by accident, because of the haste, the skydiving school gave the FBI a dummy chute sewn shut, and that one was meant for training. So that might be further guard against FBI sabotage. would possibly be the motivation for Cooper's also possibly taking some hostages with him, skydiving. Remember, they said that one of the fears was that he was going to take one of the stewardesses with him and then possibly blow up the plane.
Yeah, while the plane was still on the ground in Seattle, ground control, part of the control tower staff, advised the pilots of Flight 305 that they had been asked to relay a message from the Federal Aviation Administration, chief psychiatrist in Washington, D.C., and the message was, quote, he believes the second parachute is for the stewardess to use with him to go out, and after he leaves, the airplane will be blown up, end quote.
Yeah.
So that was the message they're giving the crew. It's like, which also says we probably shouldn't do anything to these parachutes, because then it'll be on us if one of the crew gets killed from a sabotaged parachute.
That's what I think. Yeah, that's my thinking about why Cooper wanted 4. Although, again, it goes back to that recurring motif there where he knows some things. He's planned ahead, but he also makes some mistakes. Or we don't know his reasoning. It's like, why would you grab one of the dummy chutes that was sewn shut? So again, that's a big factor for Agent Carr, thinking like, this guy, he knew a little bit, but as my grandfather used to say, a little bit of knowledge is a dangerous thing.
Yeah.
You know just enough to what you should be doing, but you're not an expert in it. And
that's how we got started in podcasting.
And it's still dangerous. We're dangerous podcasters.
Dangerous.
Well, tell me about the Boeing 727-51.
Well, the plane originally was a 727-51. It's now considered to be a 727-100. I just thought we'd touch on that because we mentioned at the top of at the first part 1 that it was a 727-100, but back then they called it a 51, and it was operated by a flight crew of 3 and could carry up to 131 passengers, and it was 133 feet long with a wingspan of 108 feet and an overall height of 34 feet. So this particular aircraft, we did track it down. I can't remember what's on an aviation forum or something, was scrapped in 1996. Eventually it had been sold from Northwest to Eastern Eastern Airlines, I think, and they flew it, and then eventually it was scrapped. There was a good period where it was flying with a test equipment on it of some kind.
Oh, interesting.
And I can't remember what that was about. It's not really important, but either way, I did wonder if the plane was still around today, and it is not. It was disassembled.
I see.
Like number 5 in Short Circuit.
And then
disassembled.
Stop it. We're going to get so many emails again.
I know.
Johnny 5. Another interesting point here. Whether knowingly or not by Cooper, the 727 turned out to be a good passenger jet to jump from, with some advantages for this, what you could say is non-recommended use. First, of course, the 727 had aft air stairs, so he could jump out the back, and the stairs could be lowered by a switch in the back, and the deployment couldn't be overridden by the pilots. We probably mentioned that in part 2, perhaps, but I think it's worth noting that he knew that. And if you'll also remember, the 727 could take off and land with the aft stairs deployed, which Northwest Orient headquarters told him couldn't be done safely. So according to author Max Gunther of the book DB Cooper, What Really Happened, civilian flight crews didn't know the stairs could be lowered during flight, since it's not something that would happen normally. Again, another nod. Of course, I love this angle. I'm not sure how much I believe in it, but that may be something a CIA agent might know. And speaking of spycraft, like a spycraft hack, something that James Bond would know. That's according to Himmelsbach. He made a note of that. It's like, okay, if he knew about that, that's not a usual thing. Was that taught to him as an evasive maneuver, a possibility? That's something else that they teach agents in the field. Well, the 727-100 had a newer modification that allowed all the fuel tanks to be refilled from a single point, allowing for fast refueling. So whether Cooper knew that or not, that meant the turnaround time on the ground would be fast, because you don't want to dally when you're in the middle of a skyjacking. Get that thing refueled and back in the air as soon as possible.
And one of the things that we didn't talk about, at least I don't know if we did, but there was a point at which the refueling was taking too long.
Right.
And one of the things that they had suggested was that there had been a vapor lock or a problem with freezing And the pilot was actually getting mad about that, about how long it was taking, because he was like, I happen to know that at the temperature we're at now, nothing is frozen. We need to get it fueling. And in addition to that, Cooper was getting uptight too.
Yeah.
So they are pretty sure that that was all stall techniques, which he probably came to expect. But because the pilot said, and this was on Sluggo's side, I think the truck went away and then it came back and it filled it up pretty quickly. And the pilot was like, I'm not even sure it was a different truck. So,
jeez. Well,
but I mean, that's to be expected. I mean, they're trying to do whatever they can to keep it on the ground.
No, the more time the FBI and the authorities have to figure this thing out, get people in place, the better for them tactically. But Cooper knew that at the beginning. Remember, he said, like, no funny business.
That's right.
Or I'll do the job.
Yeah.
So another thing that turned out in his favor was the 727 could fly low and slow without stalling, which is not typical, as far as I know, for a passenger jet. And Cooper knew about the 15-degree flap angle setting that was specific to the 727-100. Also, another thing that is often mentioned is that the 3 aft engines, even though they're towards the rear of the plane, that actually makes for a safer rear hatch bailout with the jet wash, I think. Maybe that warmed him up. I don't know. Well, the other thing that people point out was that, he was savvy enough to remember things like he took the ransom note back from Florence Schaffner, and he wore dark sunglasses for the remainder of the hijacking, although, I mean, they've already got a good look at him. That was only afterwards, but it might have been a psychological thing where even somebody gets a good look at your face, the last thing they see is you with sunglasses. That may throw you off a little bit.
And also, at least one other note that was created, he had one of the stewardesses or flight attendants write it down.
Yeah.
He didn't write it himself. So he was pretty careful about that stuff. But there's been a suggestion that he may have had ADHD as well, because what they saw him, I guess from a profile standpoint, is they saw him as someone with a big picture, but not great on the fine details, thus the loafers and the suit. And so it's like he's got the big goal set up, but is not zeroing in on the minutia enough.
That's fascinating. That's that's starting to fit with my mental picture of it, is that, broad strokes, yes, small things some were left by the wayside. Maybe he didn't think about it. Maybe there's too much going on in his head at the time. Another thing that he was thinking about, and you can speak to this, Scott, is that we always see this in the movies. I want small denomination, non-sequential bills. Well, Cooper's got to know that these things are going to be tracked. The money, the bills, they're going to be recorded somehow, at least a few of them. If he plans on spending it at all, it's going to turn up somewhere. That can all be traced back to at least where he was. That leads to somebody meeting with him and exchanging money. And so he could assume that the bill numbers had been recorded and will be tracked. And again, that's always going to trail back to him. But here's the other thing. It's that bill tracking, you think like, well, what's the importance of that? Money gets passed around so much. But that's actually how the Lindbergh kidnapper, Richard Hauptmann, was initially caught. And they traced the bills back, leading to him. And of course, the story goes is that I think they found a shoebox of the money in his garage. Hauptmann always said that, like, well, no, that was a guy I knew. He owed me some money. He left the cash behind. I hung on to it. I had nothing to do with the kidnapping. But during the trial, Hauptmann's handwriting was analyzed, and that also sealed his fate. Plus, of course, back then, they were just really anxious to nail somebody for kidnapping one of the most beloved people in the nation at the time, perhaps the most famous person in the world at the time. So it didn't go well for him, but it's also to think about clues like, leaving handwriting behind, tracing bills. But you were talking about a discrepancy of Cooper asking for $20 bills. That might be a myth, right?
Yeah, again, according to Sluggo's site, which is now defunct, but is on the Wayback Machine, the Internet Archive, which we have a link to, according to that site, he never specified the denomination. So, which is, again, it points to not the highest level of attention to the details or the minutia of the operation. Maybe he assumed he would get 20s, but the point that I think it was Special Agent Carr made or somebody made in one of the documentaries we watched was that had he requested hundreds, it would have been about a 5-pound bag to jump with, and because it was 20s, it was closer to 23 pounds or something. So
not a big difference here, really. And then people also wonder if he's not specifying, did he care about the money at all? That's another consideration. Some sleuths wonder if Cooper's jump wasn't just a last hurrah suicide of sorts. taking his own life in a big blaze of glory here. And comparative analysis with World War II aircraft bailouts under hasty, non-ideal conditions do suggest that the jump was survivable. So it's a mystery as to why or what Cooper was thinking for his second phase of the escape. Another debated mystery is how the money ended up at Tina Bar on the Columbia, whether Cooper lost some of it during the jump or maybe a run through the woods if he did survive. Or did he ditch it knowing he couldn't spend it without being tracked eventually? Maybe it wasn't about the money at all. Maybe it's just to prove it could be done, as Agent Ralph Himmelsbach postulated.
Yeah, I just want to point out one thing. I'm going to come back to Tina Bar with our suspects, but just here's one thing, a little food for thought that I'm not sure you know. I'm pretty sure this was in Brad Meltzer's Decoded series, which again had Special Agent Carr and the Citizen Sleuths being a part of it. The money on Tina Bar was upstream of where he would have theoretically landed. Just keep that in mind. I want everybody to keep that in mind.
Yeah, we're going to talk about that, actually.
Yes, it shouldn't have been there, even if it was from the night of the jump.
Oh, okay. I have another buzzword term here for theory, but it specifically deals about this money washing down business and how it's so weird. It's such a weird thing to have discovered, and such a 1 in a million shot, or 1 in 200,000 shot of somebody actually finding this stuff. Well, aside from considering the suspects, which is hypothesis, speculation, and conjecture, the only real piece of evidence to focus on is the money. And for the FBI, then, of course, after that, the amateur sleuths and enthusiasts, the investigation always follows the money. But the discovery of the partial ransom money in 1980 opened up a new round of questions and theories, and then it questions some of the initial conclusions by the FBI. Because if you remember, it was first assumed that the packets of bills Brian Ingham found had washed up there from one of the connecting waterways or tributaries that fed into the Columbia River and was ultimately deposited at Tina Bar. One theory stated in the Himmelsbach book is that Cooper hadn't landed near Lake Merwin or the Lewis River as originally extrapolated, because those feed into the Columbia River quite a ways downstream from Tina Bar.
Oh, right. So this addresses what I just said.
Yeah. So the recovered bills were stuck together, remember, and an Army Corps of Engineers hydrologist determined that the money was deposited at Tina Bar by the action of the river water brushing the bills against the rocks and the riverbed or the bank as well, not from being deliberately buried. Keep that in mind. This was the conclusion because the corners of the bills had deteriorated, causing them to have a rounded shape. That also, I believe, is something that geologist Leonard Palmer had also noted, if I remember correctly, is that the rounded corner, the edges of the bills had been worn off.
Yes.
Okay, so that suggests that this packet of bills has been bouncing around against the rocks and in the water for quite some time for it to be able to do that.
At some point.
Well, exactly.
Not necessarily right before it was found.
No,
you don't know when the water did that to it. That's something
as we're gonna see right here, because this could also give way to the recalculated landing zone extrapolation of Cooper more likely landing near the Washougal River, which feeds into the Columbia, again, quite a ways upstream from Tina Bar. So this has generally become known as the Washougal Washdown theory. Like that?
Yeah, I do.
Well, go ahead.
That's got to be a Native American Washougal, right? A Native American name.
Yes, you notice that the Western Washington Native American names differ slightly than Eastern Washington, Idaho, and Montana, of course. But yeah, they have a lot of interesting names, also like Esquim for a town on the Western Washington side. A lot of funny names. But here's the thing about the Washougal Washdown theory. It doesn't answer all the questions. Like if 3 packets got separated from the rest of Cooper's bundle, why did these 3 remain together? Why did 1 packet have 10 bills missing from it? Since the rubber bands were still intact, the packets would have had to have washed up at Tina Bar within a couple of years of being lost. The geological layering, as we've covered above, means that the bills would have had to have been deposited quite a long time after the Army Corps of Engineers dredging operation in 1974. But Tom Kay and the Cooper research team questioned geologist Leonard Palmer's finding, stating that the clay layer was possibly a natural deposit, which means that the depositing of the bills could be less than a year after Cooper jumped. See what we're saying here? One finding says, no, that was from the dredging. And so then it has to be way after 1974. The Cooper research team and Tom Kay say, well, no, if that's a natural lair, it could be within a year. However, it still doesn't explain how the packets got to Tina Bar in the first place or where they started out from.
All right, I'm chomping at the bit here to get to my part of the outline, but before I do, I see this next section here, which I've been looking at for a couple weeks now, with the word diatom in it, D-I-A-T-O-M. What the hell is that? I have no idea what a diatom is.
Two toms or a daily tom? I'm just extrapolating myself here. This freaked me out because I believe this came up in River in our research pool here. And then I was triggered. I did see it. Yeah, I was triggered to find it again, or it was on my places to check out as we're developing this. But I got hooked up with this pretty late in the research process here. And then I was freaked out by how recent this discovery was. You think this thing is all wrapped up and sewn shut like a dummy parachute bag? It isn't. Because some very, very recent findings have been found. Some later hypotheses for how these bills got there. Just to back up, obviously somebody other than Cooper could have put them there. Somebody who found the bills, thought about keeping them, but didn't want any notice. Maybe they were wanted for something else. It was too hot. So they decided to take them somewhere else, or they carried them around for a while, then just like, I'm going to bury these. That's one possibility. Other theories, possibly a wild animal carried the packets there. I know that sounds crazy, but I've had dogs that just picked up and found stuff and carried it for a long ways to deposit it in your backyard. Or like the little kitty who steals shoes. Have you seen that?
Yes, I have seen that.
It traveled like 100 miles around the neighborhood in a week or something crazy, but animals do that. Well,
there's a children's book like that, by the way. I used to read it to my son.
Oh,
I can't remember what the cat. It's the cat. I can't remember now.
Who loved just one of a pair of shoes from everyone.
It was taking stuff from the whole neighborhood, everybody's stuff. Yeah, I remember reading it to my son.
Well, at least it's an equal opportunity for Furry Thief. Well, look, people have been searching the Washougal River Valley since the recalculated potential landing zone theory came to light, and still nothing significant has been found. Although some folks wonder, maybe some piece of evidence had been covered up by the Mount St. Helens eruption in 1980, which blanketed some parts of the region in a thick layer of volcanic ash. So, to me, if Cooper was alive to bury the money himself, possibly hoping to come back for it at some point, once the heat had died down, I think he would have placed it in some kind of container that would have protected it. Even a plastic bag would have been better than nothing. And if he didn't care about the money, I would imagine he would just have burned it up to keep warm and destroy the evidence. That's what I would think. To me. So since that happened, I remember it happening in 1980. That kind of freaked me out as a kid, thinking like, how did the money get separated? What's the story there? Sometimes those accidents just kind of happen. Sometimes they're planned. Sometimes a random action causes a whole myth and story to follow up around it. Well, back to the big breaking news here. It seems Cooper's legend anyway, isn't done giving us clues and more puzzles to solve. So what about your diatoms here? Well, a very recent finding that's highlighted in an article from Seattle's NBC affiliate King 5 news station, get this, dated August 3rd, 2020. Last month, right?
Oh, yeah.
I can't keep track of the months now, but it seems that way from the numbers.
That was last month. As the,
okay.
The time that we're recording this, yes.
Well, that's when this came to light here. That's all freaked me out. It's like, really? People are still searching? Well, yes, they are. And that's why next year, next week, 5 years from now, another major piece of evidence could pop up. But here's something that Tom Kay and the Cooper research team found. Okay, now this article was written by Chris Ingalls, and I'm going to read a little bit from it here because Tom Kay says it much better than I could ever possibly hope to, and also he's a scientist. Well, it also may shed a little bit of light on the case here. So it seems they are still on the case, and yes, they just made a new discovery. This time, Tom Kay, using an electron microscope, has found something on the recovered ransom bills. They're still looking at them. Seasonal diatoms, or tiny little bits of star-shaped algae on the bills. Isn't that fascinating? And you'll find out
Are
why.
we
Here's the
saying this
second-
right? I suddenly got scared. It's
Diatoms?
Or diatoms?
That sounds even more preposterous, sir. But
Well,
go ahead and
I
look
don't
it up.
know. Yes,
No, look it
either
up.
way. I'll
because-
look it up. You keep talking. I'm
All right,
looking it up.
I'm going to keep saying it wrong, or perhaps right. Here we go. Well, look, Cade published these findings in a peer-reviewed journal called Scientific Reports, and it's the first time Cooper evidence has been peer-reviewed and published. So this is getting back to the wording of the article here. Kay examined the ransom bills 12 years ago at the request of the Seattle FBI, but only recently turned his attention to algae that could have been present on the water-soaked money. So, quote, so suddenly the light bulb came on and we wondered if we could use these different species of diatoms that we found on the Cooper bills a long time ago to determine when the money got wet and when the money landed on the bank of the Columbia, said Kay. Continuing on with his quote here, the diatoms that we found on the Cooper money are a spring species, said Kay. They bloom in the spring. They do not bloom in November when Cooper jumped. Kay said that's because it shows the money ended up in the river months after Cooper jumped on November 24th, 1971. Okay, continuing on. Because the bills only had one season of diatoms on them and did not have diatoms that bloom in the winter, Kay theorizes that the money came out of the water and landed on the bank of Tina Bar, a sandbar on the Columbia River, after only a few weeks or months. Goes back to quoting him. The money was not floating in the water for a year. Otherwise, we would have seen diatoms from the full range of the year. We only saw them from the springtime bloom. So this puts a very narrow range on when the money got wet and was subsequently buried on Tina Bar, Kay said. The scientists said the new information scuttles the FBI's original theory in the 1980s that the money somehow flowed down rivers from Cooper's believed drop zone near Lake Merwin in southwest Washington into the Washougal River and out to the Columbia, the so-called Washougal Washdown theory. Quote, we are now able for the first time to use this piece of evidence and eliminate a bunch of theories, Kay said. However, the new finding also raises more questions than it answers. How did the money end up in the water months after Cooper's daring jump? How did it end up some 18 miles as the crow flies from Cooper's suspected drop zone? How did the money get out of the Columbia River and end up mostly intact with rubber bands holding 3 stacks of $20 bills together? Cooper is still messing with us, Kay said with a grin. Cooper, who was believed to be around 40 years old at the time, would be around 90 years old now if he did survive the jump, which several FBI agents believe he did not. So yeah, Kay is publishing his findings so that citizen sleuths can have a chance to crack the case. He does not believe the FBI will reopen its investigation. And the last quote here, it's really left to the public and Cooper files like me to work on the case, he said. The FBI did not have any comment about Kay's findings. So you see what we're saying here, okay? Money did not get into the water right after Cooper jumped or around that time.
Yeah, I'm going to shed a little light on that here coming up, but I also wanted to wait until you finished that whole thing to tell you that you were saying diatom wrong.
Diatom?
No, I'm kidding. You did it right.
Oh my goodness. Oh, I did
look it up. While you were talking, I listened to the dictionary website say it in my ear. Just to make sure.
Thank goodness. No, that would have been on you, my friend, because I'm not re-saying all that. You would have had to edit
No, I
out
would have just had you re-say it once, and I would have cut it in a million times.
It'd be your voice
and with
saying
you, like it would
diatom.
sound weird. Yeah.
Tom K had finding
anyway,
diatom.
there is a really incredible theory that connects to all this
Right.
on one of the suspects. So I'll be bringing that forth here in a little bit.
Okay, well, I'm pretty much done with my section here. That was you couldn't get more current than that, except for maybe something happening today as we were convening to record. But
something
that's
always
pretty
happens when we release the show. So
yeah,
we got to keep the synchronicity.
You got to keep it going. And then the thing that kills me is that 3 months from now, somebody will email us saying like, my grandfather was DB Cooper. You should check him out. And it's like, here's the proof. And it'll be all the rest of the money. And it's like, dang it. Well, I guess we'll just do an update show. But again, to recap, because that's important. The idea here is that if Cooper fell into the river upon the jump, didn't open his chute, just fell in the water, the money gets separated. Some of that floats down, gets deposited at Tina Bar. That couldn't have happened in the winter. So it has to have happened in a springtime setting. So he jumped November 24th. You have to flash forward now until the spring. So that's at least several weeks or several months later that the money actually gets into the water, then gets covered up somehow. Or it had to have been a long time after that it was protected somehow, then weirdly, then ends up in the water in the springtime, then gets deposited and covered up. So yeah, he's right. At least it narrows it down to a springtime, either following 71, so the spring of 72, or sometime thereafter.
And we have to, we got to keep in mind, this is about 10 years after the jump. It's not recent that this money was found. This was 1980.
Right.
So it was a long time ago relative to now, but it was still also nearly a decade after the jump.
Absolutely.
So you got to keep all that in mind when you're evaluating all that stuff.
Well, just to sum up my section here, and the attitude and stance as it is left by the authorities and the FBI, this comes from the FBI.gov website at the end of the small short article that they have posted for the DB Cooper entry here. It just says, perhaps Cooper didn't survive the jump from his plane. After all, the parachute he used couldn't be steered. His clothing and footwear were unsuitable for a rough landing. And he had jumped into a wooded area at night. A dangerous proposition for even a seasoned pro, which evidence suggests Cooper was not. And this theory is backed up because of the money being found in 1980, that had he survived, he most likely would have kept it all together. That was a sizable portion for a chunk of it got lost. Now, there are theories that he may have fumbled some of it while jumping from the plane. That's how it got separated. Who knows? Maybe he ditched some of it. Maybe he lost it running through the woods, as we said. So from their position here, keep this in mind. Pretty dumb and stupid for a seasoned parachutist, a pro, to attempt. You wouldn't even do that. That's somebody who just, with a lot of bravura, thinks they could make it or didn't care. And that will now point to what kind of a person would do this? What's their profile like? Who are the usual and the unusual suspects? So before I turn the reins over to Scott here, let's take a look at the fun, unusual suspects.
The ones that are most out there.
Well, they are pretty out there, but they're out there. I'll tell you that here. Well, one, we had an email from a listener, Rekka, who wrote to us kindly about the DB Cooper series, and she had a couple of interesting points. One, her favorite theory about who DB Cooper was is that he survived the jump and the heist, and he went on to reinvent himself as Tommy Wiseau of The Room. You know that movie, don't you?
Yes, I do.
For those of you that don't, Tommy Wiseau is the creator of the indie classic, one of those "it's so bad it's good" movies called The Room. Somebody who had, and I can kind of get this, he had a chunk of unexplainable money, really, like millions of dollars. And that's one thing that probably goes against being Cooper, unless he invested wisely. And he just went out and made a movie based on his own ego and just wanting to do it and wanting to be an actor and movie maker, but having zero knowledge about movie making. Almost like he never watched a movie.
Yeah.
Because talk about this podcast not making sense. The movie made, it's just out there. It's really crazy. It came out in 2003. There's actually a pretty good film made about the making of it by James Franco. I think he directs and is the star of it, where he plays Tommy, and it's called The Disaster Artist. And it's just kind of heartbreaking and charming and just wacky and funny and just unbelievable. But if you think about it, that movie came out in 2003. Tommy looks to be about 40 or so. I'll give you this. He is a mysterious dude. You can't get any information out of the guy. He said he was from New Orleans, and he just does not have, it sounds like he has a covered up Eastern European accent.
Yeah.
Somehow it just has a weird, it's just weird. The whole thing's weird, but the age doesn't fit. But you do wonder about somebody with a weird background who suddenly has come into money. That characteristic will come into some of the characters and suspects we'll be looking at in a minute here. So there you go. Thank you so much, Rekka. Also, one more thing she mentioned, kind of weird, and talking about my point about how people might come to suspect just people that give a weird clue. She was talking about a podcast called Missing in Alaska. And the podcast episode, at least, was about 2 U.S. congressmen who died in a mysterious plane crash in the 70s.
Oh, yeah.
But on
I know
episode
this crash.
7, right? Yeah, remember that?
Yeah, I know this. I know this story. We've looked this up
Yeah.
before for some reason. I think it's
Right.
Hale Boggs, Thomas Hale Boggs Sr.
Yeah.
Yeah. But
Yeah,
I think we
right.
looked it up maybe when we were talking about Amelia or something else. This has come up before.
It's another weird mystery, right? Well, she was saying in episode 7 of the series here, again, I think the podcast is called Missing in Alaska. The episode is titled Don't Knock Arizona. And she says it contains an interview with the son of someone who could have been potentially involved in the plane disappearance. But weirdly, at 45 minutes and 50 seconds in, this person casually mentions that the only time his dad was ever interviewed by the cops was not regarding the congressman's plane, but rather because he was friends with a man from Alaska named as a DB Cooper suspect by the cops, who loved to jump out of planes and who disappeared and was never heard from again after November 1971.
Oh. Also, I was wrong. I was thinking of Will Rogers, who died in a plane crash in Alaska. And
yes,
which we mentioned. We mentioned during Amelia Earhart, Wiley Post.
That's right.
Yeah, it's a different
Post,
crash, crash, but yes.
Ah, I see. Yes, yeah. But just a weird story, and that's what I'm saying.
Yeah. So did they? Is there a name with this guy?
She did not say it. I did not have time to listen to the episode, but again, I encourage you. It's called Missing in Alaska.
Okay.
It's episode 7, and it happens around 45 minutes and 50 seconds in, as Erica says. It's just, that's what I'm saying, though. A couple of these suspects that we're going to take a look at, somebody has a weird dream, mentions something on a deathbed, these little seeds, then somebody watches a documentary, like, I think that's my brother.
Right.
That really looks like my brother. Oh my gosh, I got to tell somebody about it.
Yeah, there's a lot of that
screenwriter.
Going on.
There's a lot of that going on. All right, well, anyway, to wrap up this section here, two other weird things. Well, this is from the wiki entry here, as a bit of this is. It's a story about other criminals latching on, of course, or doing a little bit of larceny here. There were apparently 2 men who were able to swindle $30,000 from a Newsweek reporter named Carl Fleming back in 1972. I guess they were trying to sell an interview with Cooper.
Yeah, they were trying to prove that they were connected to the case and they could do this story about Cooper by counterfeiting money with some of the serial numbers from the list of wanted serial numbers. So it's interesting. It's an interesting con because they're not just counterfeiting money, which they could go out and try to pass in the real world and make their money that way. They're actually counterfeiting it just to get a news story done and to get that lump sum off the counterfeited money, pretending that it's the money that came off the plane.
Oh my god,
convoluted. That's why that's when Hollywood they call it high concept, which can be harder to. But it worked until they got caught. So it didn't really work, but it worked for a second.
Well, it sounds a little bit to me like Mr. Kobayashi, another mysterious figure. Mr. Kent had swindled $60,000 from one of his associates.
Yes.
Sorry, that was terrible, but then he's doing an Indian accent, and he's not Indian. Anyway, 2 other crazy, maybe not crazy, 2 other way out there woo-woo possibilities. Bigfoot had rescued DB Cooper, took him to safety.
And or killed him. I would go with killed him also.
Possibly could have killed him, broke him in half, stuffed him in a tree.
With the money.
And some of the money, Bigfoot no need bills. Just threw them in the water. Yeah. But that guy is jerk.
Yeah.
So, Anyway,
wow.
Anyway, actually Bigfoot ties into a lot of the lore.
Yeah, that's true.
Comically, of course. It was a Bigfoot area. Exactly right. It's the area of the Ape Canyon incident with Fred Beck. Remember, we talked about that in the 1920s during our exhaustive series on the Patterson-Gimlin film. That is south and around Mount St. Helens, Bigfoot country, my friend.
Yeah.
So I know people joke about that, but the other way out hypothesis that most will find laughable, but I've kind of come to weirdly respect and fear a little. It's the missing 411.
The idea that
people go missing.
He went missing.
Weirdly.
He landed and he met the wrong thing in the wrong space-time continuum and evaporated.
Well, obviously he may or may not be missing. if you do think he's missing, there's natural means, and then there are supernatural or paranormal means by which he is missing. That is something I just thought of, but like, yeah.
Well,
I can prove that.
there's a couple of our listeners that have pointed to some conspiracy theories, and we just get these out of the way
Yes.
right here at the top, because we're going to dive into the more meatier stuff here in a second. But I believe somebody reached out to us on Twitter and said, hey, have you looked in the possibility, and this is one of my favorite, and we mentioned it at the top of the show, is that he didn't exist at all. That this guy, that this was an inside job, possibly perpetrated by the airline itself, who was
that's right.
interested in, I don't know, upping security protocols or something like that. Is that something you're familiar with, that story?
Yes, I know exactly what you're talking about. That was a comment left by a listener named Jason, who posted his comment for part 2 on the webpage for that episode.
That's where I saw it, yeah.
Yeah, and I'm not hesitant about reading this because, of course, he left the comment on a public website.
Right.
So here's the comment left by Jason. Something to consider. Cooper wasn't the only one to benefit from the hijacking. The airlines wanted the airport to provide the security and to offload insurance liabilities. Up to that point, it was everyone for themselves. A good conspiracy is the airline put Cooper up to the hijacking and helped to cover up his involvement in order to get the transit authority they wanted. If Cooper didn't die in the jump, how did he know they were tracking the money, and how did he launder it so those bills never showed up? It's rumored that the airline president burned boxes of something out back in the offices afterward. The money, perhaps. A small price to pay for the millions of dollars they saved since then. Well, it's an interesting angle, and I would say that, to my point, as we said earlier here, I would think Cooper would just suspect that the money was going to be traced. And it's a bit risky to burn the bills. On the other hand, people do weird stuff in weird capers. But so that's one conspiracy theory. But getting back to Sluggo, who, again, since Scott found the website, I've been really digging into that one. And I tend to trust it because it is one of those guys that he's just a no baloney kind of guy. He said there was so much myth and speculation and stuff as added to the story, as Scott was talking about. Like, he wanted to create a website where it's just the real story and be a repository for actual facts that have been come across and not a lot of people's speculations, as you could say. But regarding the conspiracy theories here, Sluggo will have none of it. This is what he says about conspiracy theories from Sluggo's Northwest 305 hijacking research site we've mentioned here. So he says, what you will not find on this site, you will not find conspiracy theories on this website. If you want to read about how the FBI arranged for Cooper to do the skyjacking and get away with the money as payment for assassinating John F. Kennedy, or how Cooper worked for the CIA and the skyjacking was a device to distract the public's attention from the Vietnam War, well, you're going to have to go somewhere else. You won't find that kind of stuff here. So he's not entertaining any way out theories. But of course, those are going to pop up with anything like this.
Yeah, and somewhere I read, I can't remember who made this assessment, but Donald Nyrop, who was the CEO of Northwest at the time,
right?
One of the things that was made clear about his character from people that knew him or had interviewed him or worked with him was that his number one priority would have been the safety of the people on the aircraft. So it's hard to imagine him engineering this whole thing that doesn't jibe with that personality trait that people said about him from a conspiratorial standpoint. But it is an interesting idea that we didn't have cameras in the airports back then, or, they didn't have a camera on the guy buying the ticket, or if they did, that footage is lost and it doesn't exist anywhere. So really, you have a handful of people saying this guy existed and didn't get off the plane.
Mm-hmm.
It's not inconceivable as a conspiracy, but pretty hard to imagine, especially after all this time. And the more people you have involved, the less likely it is to be kept a secret. And that would have been a lot of people between the ticket agent and the entire flight crew and many of the passengers. That would be a pretty hard thing to pull off. So, but because we like to talk about the far out, we have to at least address it. I don't want to just slough it off, but I just don't think it's likely in this case based on everything that we've learned.
We're not big conspiracy guys. You probably figured that out if you've listened to our overview. But we do like to mention them. I find them fascinating, and they're curious. But even for us, we're going to kind of stick to what's been discovered and verified. But regarding possible suspects, this is what I will say, as Scott is going to launch into profiling each of these folks, is that there are weird things that pop up with probably each of them that make you go, and, all of them have some angle. And then there's other things that like, well, okay, that really makes it unlikely. But it's so weird that this coincidence would happen regarding them.
All right. So here I'm going to do Rich Haddam's trademark move before I get into the suspects, and that's this. That's when he puts his hands together and rubs them really fast because he's excited about talking about. So I am excited about talking about all these suspects.
He's either excited about what he's going to tell you, he's going to drop some knowledge bomb on you, or there's a dirty martini being made somewhere nearby. One of the two, or probably both.
Or both. Yeah. Well, there's been hundreds of suspects over the years in the DB Cooper skyjacking or hijacking, and there are podcasts solely dedicated to this case. And we mentioned one already, the DB Cooper Vortex. There are other singular episodes. Obviously, lots of shows in our milieu have covered DB Cooper as well. The bottom line is you could easily talk about each suspect for several episodes. You could do many years on this. My hat's off to the guys doing that. I would lose my mind if I was that deep into it. That's not what we're here to do, but we've picked a few to cover the broad strokes and one or two to go deeper on as our cursory research allows. So we've got overviews on at least 10 of them, and for 2 of them, I read entire books. So I'm anxious to share some of that information, and we pulled some quotes from those books that I think are going to give everybody a little bit of pause when it comes to thinking about this stuff. Oh, and I think we want to mention Generation Y did an episode on this back in 2015. Those guys are friends of ours. So, I'm excited to talk about it.
Let me ask you this, though. Did the Cooper Vortex podcast hosts, how did they find out we did the mention? Did they listen to the episode, part 1, and then...
Yeah, because they must have listened, or they must have heard, or somebody told them that. We know, but they're friends with our friend Chris Williamson. So, and he may also be listening. So there's
very good.
There's a lot of connections there. But anyway, thanks for listening, everybody who listens, especially to this one. We appreciate people hanging in there. We were supposed to be off this week, but
it's a bit of an outlier.
It's a bit of an outlier, and it's going to take me a few minutes to edit this, but here we go. Let's talk a little bit about the suspects. I tried to put these in order for me, and this is subjective, obviously, but this order for me is from least intriguing to most intriguing. And that's, that's
the best way to go.
Personally, it's my personal point of view. So there's definitely some confirmation bias coming into play here, but that seemed like the best way to deal with this.
I'll go with that.
All right. I've given each suspect my own nickname. Now, if other people have come up with nicknames for the suspects and I'm aping those, it is unknowingly.
Wait, are you recording this caveat here?
Yes.
This disclaimer? I see.
So our first suspect, the boatman. That's what I'm calling this guy. His name is Joseph S. Lockage, Lakich. His name's very close to a good friend of mine's name in Detroit, actually. I was like, wait, is that guy? No, it's not. That guy that owns the Detroit Record Club, which is a great place to get records. And anyway, I call Mr. Lockage the boatman because there's this theory that this gentleman has put forth, and he has a YouTube video, which we have a link to. It's about 7 minutes long. As of right now, not a lot of people have seen it. I think it's had 4,000 views.
That's not too shabby.
No, it's posted by a guy named Bill Rollins, who says via titles, there's no narration on this, but via titles in the video, that he is an instrument-rated pilot and that he's figured out how this has all gone down. And he puts forth a pretty interesting theory. He suggests that the Merwin Dam was the drop point, that Cooper did all this pre-planning, that he had bought a couple of boats, an aluminum boat and a Zodiac-type boat, so that he could land just below the Merwin Dam, which was well lit and would be his guide when he would jump out of the plane. Then he would take the boats and get back to his camper, and that his base was at Tina Bar, where that money was found by Brian Ingram almost 10 years later, and that this is how the whole operation went down. The most interesting thing about the Lockage theory is the motive. One of the motives that is suggested there is that he was getting revenge for the untimely death of his daughter. And I actually found an article related to that I thought was kind of interesting. Her name was Susan Lockage, or Susan Lockage Giff. Mm-hmm. This article is from the News Palladium. October 1971, October 5th, 1971. We have a membership to newspapers.com. This is out of that. This heading here, it's an article that says FBI caused murder of pilot. The operator of a Tennessee aircraft company said the FBI agents who foiled a hijack attempt, which took 3 lives, staged a desperate bluff which unnecessarily caused the death of a young pilot. The FBI declined comment. Brent Downs, a 30-year-old captain for Big Brothers Aircraft Incorporated of Nashville, died in a volley of shots Monday when his commandeered plane touched down for refueling. Downs was killed in the cockpit of the 6-seat Airhawk Commander, shot twice from behind, police said. The hijacker, George M. Giff Jr. of Nashville, also killed his young wife and then himself. So his young wife, she's pictured here, Susan Lockage Giff, Giffe, was kidnapped and shot to death on a charter plane taken at gunpoint from Nashville to Jacksonville by her estranged husband, George Mallory Giff Jr. The plane had been chartered by Giff on Sunday, but police said he used a gun to force the pilot, also killed aboard when Mrs. Giff began kicking and screaming. So the theory is that Joseph Lockage wanted revenge for this, and that's what he's saying took place there. So that's the motive that he's, these are all real events, and that all connects somehow, but that's the motive that he's saying for Lockage.
And we do have to keep in mind, he did say he had a grudge, not with you, possibly though with the airline or some other entity.
Just a grudge. I start with this one because it's fun conjecture, and it's interesting how he's mapped out the route and everything, but there's a lot of stuff about it that doesn't really hold up for me. One of the first things is that he suggests that he was going to use the Merwin Dam as the place that he wanted to land at, and the chute he picked, as we've said over and over again, was not controllable. And to be clear, this parachute is one of the round kind, the old school paratrooper classic. You're watching the World War II movie. It's a ball. It's a circular, or a hemispherical, and you can't control where that goes. So knowing where the lights were at the Merwin Dam at most might tell you when to jump out of the back of the plane, but whether or not you're going to get to it from 2 miles up is highly unlikely. And also there was cloud cover at 5,000 feet, so there was no way that he could have seen the lights. Even if there was a break in the clouds, though, let's say he did see it, he couldn't have controlled his descent to come down. I agree with the FBI and everyone else about that. He's going to come down wherever he comes down. Whatever his plan was, it was to improvise after he landed.
Yeah. No, there's a lot of things I do like about this, especially the change of boats and using the riverways to get where he needed, especially to Portland International Airport, which at the time, theoretically, I guess you could boat up to it and just walk in. Of course, as we know now, airport security was much less stringent as it is now. So that's one way to get there. But the other things, as you mentioned, one supposition from this theory by Mr. Bill Rollins is that in his bag, he had, in his attaché case, he had some avionics which could track possibly where he was at. So you need some sort of transponder device or something to time about where he would be at what point in time. And we don't believe that he had that. He did let Florence Schaffner look inside the bag briefly, just to see that there was possibly a fake bomb there, and what she recognized were cylinders, wiring, a large battery. I forget the name of the type of battery. It's a large cylinder battery that was very popular at the time as something to possibly trigger the bomb with a little bit of electricity. But nothing is what she would describe as, electronic components, anything to mark, because he would need to know if he was going to jump out somewhere near the dam, he would have to be fairly exact, or he's going to be 5 miles away walking through the woods. Yeah. So that doesn't fit. The other part for me is him accidentally dropping the money at Tina Bar. And as we just discussed, according to the diatoms, that did not happen around the time that he jumped in November. It would have had to have been deposited there by the springtime diatoms sometime in the springtime. So that for me is not fitting. But I do like the plan of using the camper as a base, using the boats to kind of maneuver his way to get there, and then once he landed, using all that.
Yeah, and I'm curious where he got this information, because there is evidence that he had a camper. And so
Right.
that does come up. So there's some parts of it that make sense, but just the age of the money, and also I think the idea of him maneuvering to Merwin Dam, especially without any kind of avionics. And I don't know at that point how you could have avionics that were small enough to fit in a suitcase
I
that
don't
were
think
going to
so.
allow you
Yeah.
to figure out where you were. So so for me, my verdict on the boatman, Mr. Lockage,
Yeah.
is that he is not a viable suspect.
Yeah, I vaguely remember also from the research here that they weren't using the types of avionics that they have now in planes that are much more precise
No.
to track position.
So our next subject, I call him the Hitchhiker. His name is Walter Rekka. There's a few of these guys you could have called the Hitchhiker, but I like that for this one. And Mr. Rekka's last name is Recca. This is pretty compelling off of just one event and a witness. Rekka was, in fact, a vet and a member of the Michigan parachute team. And apparently, Rekka told a close friend of his that he was Cooper over a recorded telephone call. And Rekka gave his friend, Carl Laurin, Laurin, permission to share his story of being DB Cooper after he died. Rekka even drew up a notarized letter about it, and when he died at the age of 80 in 2014, Laurin was cleared to share Rekka's story. And the story is pretty interesting. Laurin is also an expert jumper, and he determined that he thought Cooper had landed near the town of, you're going to have to help me with this one, Forrest, Cle Elum in Washington.
Cle Elum.
Cle Elum,
Yes.
thank you. Cle Elum
Yes.
in Washington. I had not heard of that town. It's CLE space ELUM.
Oh, it's very popular.
Well, I'd like to check it out. I bet it's
Mostly from the name, I think. Yeah.
picturesque. But it sounds
There's
picturesque.
there's also a George Washington, of course.
Oh, of course. Well, that makes sense. Well, this whole story about Mr. Rekka centers around an eyewitness saying that he was driving a dump truck and he picked up a guy walking on the side of the road looking like a, quote, drowned rat in the bad weather. That was on the night, you guessed it, of November 24th, 1971. Now, after some amateur sleuthing, Mr. Laurin tracked down the truck driver. And the story was a dead match for what Rekka had told him. So they had apparently stopped at a cafe. They had some coffee. Rekka described the truck driver as being dressed like a cowboy. And that's how Laurin wound up finding him. I think it was a big dump truck. So he called around looking for a dump truck driver in the area who dressed like a cowboy in a small town area.
Hasn't really narrow it down.
No,
for
but
that,
but it was a
region,
small
but
enough
sure.
area that but they figured it out. So Laurin took all of this apparently to a forensic linguist who did a thorough evaluation and concluded after looking at passports, ID cards, pictures, and clippings that he could not only not rule Rekka out as Cooper, he was compelled by the fact that Rekka's story of being picked up by this driver and the truck driver's story gathered 5 years later were identical. So this forensic linguist declared publicly that he believed Walter Rekka was DB Cooper. This is one of those ones, like you were saying, that seems to have something pretty compelling with it. There's actually a book on this. It's called Getting the Truth, I Am DB Cooper. And we'll have a link to that in the show notes. So there's a couple of things about this that are interesting to me. And I think I forgot to mention that in terms of Mr. Lockage earlier, the boatman, when you look at the picture of him and you compare it to the sketches, I just don't see it.
Yeah.
There's something you just don't see. And here is the thing about Mr. Rekka. Again, not a lot of resemblance between the pictures and him. Of course, he has a big bushy, like Tom Selleck mustache in the photo of him that you find online. So my verdict on Mr. Rekka is no. And also in the photo, he does not look like him, although he has a big bushy Tom Selleck mustache, which probably doesn't help. But I just don't know if that story for me holds water. I'm keeping in mind now because we as we said earlier in this series, it's not our first rodeo. We went through this on Amelia Earhart, for example. Everybody has their theories, and some people are very, very adamant about their theories being right and other theories being wrong. I mean, no offense to folks when I say this is, it's not working for me. It's just, and this is my very cursory look at it. Some people have spent years and years and years on just one of these, and we certainly haven't done that. We've only been at this 3 or 4 weeks. So, but I'm not on board with Mr. Rekka based on what I know.
Yeah. Well, look, here's the thing. Good for you bringing up Amelia Earhart. It just reminded me of the doc photo at Jalowit. you say it was not Amelia and Fred sitting at the dock, and you're mistaken. That's not a white lady and a white guy. Her wearing a white shirt with a woman with a short haircut. But it looks a lot like it. Now, I tend to believe that there's something to that photo. But a lot of people will say, like, well, no, it's just a coincidence. You're looking into it. And what did the cowboy dump truck driver really see that night, and who he picked up? Is it something kind of close? Like, he didn't take a photo of the guy.
Right.
And I have to go back to, well, the people who did really see Cooper very well give a very clear description of it. So that's going to figure very prominently for me going down this list of suspects. They got to look like that sketch in some way.
Yeah, I agree. Well, this brings us to our next suspect. This would be the one I call the Merchant Marine, Barb Dayton. Barb Dayton's a pretty fascinating person. Barb was born Robert Dayton in 1926 and served in both the Merchant Marines and the U.S. Army, and also later worked with explosives. In 1969, Dayton had gender reassignment surgery and adopted the name Barbara. Barbara herself claimed to have staged the Cooper hijacking to get back at the airlines for making it too difficult for a woman to become an airline pilot.
Oh.
Now, the FBI has never said anything about her. People say that she reverted to her male persona to pull off the ultimate disguise. But ultimately, she in fact recanted her confession, supposedly because she was worried about prosecution.
Well, there is that, yes.
Yeah, there is that. And there's some good information on this at one of the best sources for all of this stuff is a website called the Mountain News, which is a news organization out of Washington. And this is a pretty great article on this that we have. There is a good book, too, called The Legend of DB Cooper, Death by Natural Causes. And that's actually written by a married couple that knew Barb. I think they had planes at the same airstrip and had known Barb for quite some time. So that's another interesting suspect. However, in looking at the pictures of Barb as Robert at the time period, I did not, again, see a real good match. There was a low resemblance, but it was more of one than it was with the prior two that we've mentioned. But for me, this is a pretty thin connection. It's a good story, but a thin connection.
Yeah. Well, again, things that click with it. Working with explosives.
Yep.
So they could possibly fabricate something that looked pretty close to a bomb. On the other hand, as well, you could get some road flares and some loose red wiring and an alarm clock and a big battery. Jam that into an attaché case, and who's going to know the difference?
Roadrunner and Coyote.
Right. You need the big loud ticking alarm clock, though. Yeah. That's classic. So again, it's another story where there are some weird points to it that possibly line up, possibly a motive, but they have to fit the description.
Well, and this plays into an idea of doing it for a reason besides the money. And people, then you get to think about these people that want to say that they did it for this idea, whether or not they actually did it, because they want to draw attention to. I mean, Barb probably wanted to draw attention to the point that it was hard for a woman to become a pilot. So it makes sense to take credit for the crime to draw attention to that, even if you didn't really do it. And then, of course, if you're going to recant it because you're afraid of being prosecuted, then you recant it, but you still manage to make your point. And there's no shortage of suspects that seem to be wanting to bask in the glory of the crime, but that they couldn't have possibly done it. Now, I'm not saying that with Barb, but the FBI has actually never mentioned anything about Barb. And like I said, I don't think Barb lines up with the picture.
Yeah.
Well, let's move on to the copycat. Now, this is pretty fascinating. There's actually a lot of copycats. Before we get into this gentleman's name is Richard Floyd McCoy.
He was a favorite suspect at some point by the FBI, too.
Yes, he was. And we're going to talk about why that was. But let's back up a little bit. I want to read this section from Wikipedia about copycat crimes after Cooper jumped. In all, 15 hijackings similar to Cooper's, all unsuccessful, were attempted in 1972. With the advent of universal luggage searches in 1973, the general incidence of hijackings dropped dramatically. There were no further notable Cooper imitators until July 11th, 1980, not too far before Brian Ingram found that money on Tina Bar, when Glenn K. Tripp seized Northwest Flight 608 at Seattle-Tacoma Airport, demanding $600,000.
Ooh, up the stakes.
Yes, it is. Now, and parenthetically, it says here that someone else said it was 100,000. But either way, demanding money, 2 parachutes, and this is my favorite part: the assassination of his boss. That's really that is up there. That's the demand everybody wants to make.
You don't understand? That guy's a jerk. Yeah, he's got might as well ask for that too.
A quick-thinking flight attendant had secretly drugged Tripp's alcoholic beverage with Valium. After a 10-hour standoff, during which Tripp reduced his demands to 3 cheeseburgers and a head start on getting away, he was apprehended. However, 3 years later, on January 21st, 1983, while still on probation, he hijacked the same Northwest flight, this time en route, and demanded to be flown to Afghanistan.
Okay, what about this? No money. Forget the cheeseburgers. Just Afghanistan.
Just Afghanistan.
Afghanistan plus the cheeseburgers. I just love that. Yeah, it's like you got a bit of a buzz. You got the munchies.
Yeah.
Look, just what can you get me? Make sure they're good cheeseburgers, though.
Well, according to the Wikipedia entry, when that plane landed in Portland, poor Mr. Tripp was shot and killed by FBI agents.
Yeah, they don't play around with that stuff.
Yeah, that's so no joking there. So that was, but 15 copycats. That's one of them. Let's talk about Richard Floyd McCoy. He is the most famous DB Cooper copycat. He committed his crime 4.5 months after Cooper. He hijacked a United Airlines plane for ransom, and he actually is from my home state of North Carolina, where I live now, from Kinston, which, for those of you keeping track, is also the home of Jamie Presley.
Yes.
Actress that you may know.
Get her on the show.
Yeah. She also was Poison Ivy. He served in Vietnam. He was a demo expert and a pilot. He was also in the Utah National Guard and a skydiving enthusiast. Mr. McCoy taught Mormon Sunday school and studied law enforcement at BYU, Brigham Young University. He boarded this flight as James Johnson, the most unimaginative fake name ever, in Denver.
Could have been, yeah.
So, and there was...
It could have been James Smith.
Yeah, Jim Smith, John Smith. This plane had 85 passengers on it. It was on a stopover in Denver. It was a 727, same as DB Cooper. Mm-hmm. There is a funny little animated thing that we found a link to that it shows the plane and then like a person jumping out of the back, a tiny person. And so I do want to link to that. It's very funny. Anyway,
I sent that. That's on the wiki page.
Yeah, it's on the wiki page. It's just a little guy jumping out of the back of the plane. It's great. One of the big things about Cooper, though, is witnesses said he was in his 40s. Richard McCoy was actually only 29 when he committed this crime. Listen to this Wikipedia entry on Mr. McCoy. Following fingerprint and handwriting matches, McCoy was arrested 2 days after the hijacking. McCoy was on National Guard duty, flying one of the helicopters involved in the search for him. Yeah. So inside his house, FBI agents found a jumpsuit and a duffel bag with cash totaling $499,970. So that supports that he did ask for $500 or $600 or whatever.
Right. But you're pressing your luck a little bit.
Pressing it a little bit, yeah. He claimed innocence, but was convicted of the hijacking, received a 45-year sentence. Once incarcerated at the federal penitentiary at Lewisburg, Pennsylvania, McCoy used his access to the prison's dental office to fashion a fake handgun out of dental paste. He and a crew of convicts escaped on August 10th, 1974 by commandeering a garbage truck and crashing it through the prison's main gate while the A-Team theme played. I'm kidding. The A-Team theme was not played. That does sound like it. The other two were captured 3 days later following a shootout after a bank robbery.
Ooh,
3 months later, he was out for 3 months. The FBI located McCoy in Virginia Beach, Virginia, where he had been trying to find Edgar Casey's Institute. Just kidding.
That's right. Well, could be.
News reports stated that on November 9th, 1974, McCoy walked into his home and was met by FBI agents Nick O'Hara, Kevin McPartland, and Gerald Houlihan. He fired at them, and all agents opened fire, killing McCoy. So...
where's that movie?
I'm sure it's out there being developed somewhere.
Everything it's in a stack on some... producer's desk.
It was written and somebody went,
printed out.
Yeah.
My
verdict,
quite dramatic, though.
Yeah, and my verdict on this guy is no. He had an alibi for the Cooper. The night of the Cooper hijacking, he was with family. It was Thanksgiving, and he was with
Yes, I
family.
remember that.
Yeah,
Right. They
so-
looked at him, but he had had an alibi, a lot of involvement though. And again, one of those, just a handful of things that do line up.
Yeah, exactly. This brings us to the gambler. The gambler, William Gossett.
Kenny,
No,
not Kenny Rogers.
not Kenny Rogers and not
it?
Lou Gossett Jr., but William Gossett,
Oh,
the gambler. He had the training. He had been Vietnam and Korea. He
yeah.
also hosted a radio show about the paranormal out of Salt Lake City.
No way.
Where were you in 1971, Forrest?
At home with my parents.
Well, he was also known for being obsessed with the DB Cooper case. He collected all kinds of stuff on it. And when he was older, he told his children and a retired judge that he was Cooper. Now, this is some quoted material I'm going to read to you from Above Top Secret, a website we've referenced many times in the past. We have a link to it in the show notes. According to Galen Cook, who's a name you'll see a lot if you read anything about this Cooper stuff, a lawyer who has collected information related to Gossett for years, Gossett once showed his sons a key to a Vancouver, British Columbia safe deposit box, which he claimed contained the long-missing ransom money. Gossett's eldest son, Greg, said that his father, a compulsive gambler who was always, quote, strapped for cash, showed him, quote, wads of cash just before Christmas 1971, weeks after the Cooper hijacking. He speculated that Gossett gambled the money away in Las Vegas. The FBI has no direct evidence implicating Gossett and cannot even reliably place him in the Pacific Northwest at the time of the hijacking. Quote, there is not one link to the DB Cooper case, end quote, said Special Agent Carr, other than the statements Gossett made to someone.
Well, not just somebody, his own son.
Well, his own son. But, you know, there's a lot of things going on here. There's a lot of things I want to say about this particular type of suspect. This fits a mold for me out of this list of suspects of these guys who are kind of these ne'er-do-wells that are con artists and career criminals. And that, you know, they got it later into life and they thought, God, I really screwed this. I just didn't do anything I thought I was going to do with my life.
Right.
But God, how much would the people that don't respect me, my loved ones or whatever, respect me if I could convince them that I was DB Cooper, I was the guy.
If I could convince them that I pulled off a successful crime.
Yeah, I did this. I made it happen. So I get that. And in a way, it's kind of sad. It's like, you know, because you see these con artists want to be like, let me tell you what, I pulled the ultimate con. And
Right.
I don't know. I don't see it. But then on the other hand, my counterpoint to that is I've made this list. I've decided how interesting people are. I'm going from least interesting to most interesting on my own personal subjective opinion. It could be the very first person I mentioned, the boatman with the short little paragraph, is the one that did it. And I've already written him off. So it's hard to say what's happening here. So in my note to myself here, and I don't have the picture in the outline, was that when you look at this guy's picture, Mr. Gossett, and you look at the DB Cooper sketches, it is a lot alike. These folks are alike. And I'm going to force, just so you know, I think I'm going to make a montage for us for this episode. After the 50 years it takes me to edit it, I'm going to make
I'll be counting
all
on
of each
that.
suspect next to the sketches.